For most of modern history, taxation was not just a financial tool, it was a political event. Governments could not simply take money because they needed it. They had to ask. And asking meant exposure, debate, resistance, and sometimes rebellion. Taxes were visible, deliberate, and constrained by law. That constraint shaped how states behaved for centuries. In early constitutional systems, taxation was inseparable from representation. Kings learned this the hard way. In England, repeated attempts to raise revenue without parliamentary approval triggered backlash that eventually limited royal power. By the time the phrase "no taxation without representation" appeared in the American colonies, it was already a well-established principle. If the state wanted resources, it needed consent. Not theoretical consent, but formal approval through assemblies, budgets, and recorded votes. This made taxation slow and politically dangerous. Every new tax created winners and losers. Every percentage point increased risk protests, electoral punishment, or worse. Lawmakers understood that voters might tolerate temporary hardship, but they rarely forgave politicians who openly raised taxes without a compelling reason. As a result, tax increases were often tied to emergencies, wars, Reconstruction, national survival. Outside of crisis, governments were expected to live within their means or face consequences. Because taxes were explicit, people could see them. Income taxes appeared on pay slips. Sales taxes showed up on receipts. Customs duties raised prices on imported goods. Citizens might not like these charges, but they could identify them. That visibility mattered. It allowed political opposition to form. It allowed journalists to criticize policy. It allowed voters to connect government spending with personal cost. The legal structure reinforced this visibility. In most democracies, taxation required legislation. That meant public proposals, committee reviews, amendments, and final votes. Budget documents were published. Deficits were debated. The process created friction, and friction limited how aggressively governments could extract resources from the economy. This system worked reasonably well when states were small and obligations were limited. But over time, governments promised more. Social security systems expanded. Healthcare commitments grew. Infrastructure networks aged. Military and security budgets increased even in peacetime. Voters demanded stability, protection, and prosperity all at once. The cost of governing rose faster than traditional tax systems could handle politically. Here, a structural problem emerged. Governments could not easily raise taxes enough to fund their commitments, but they also could not easily cut spending without backlash. Cutting benefits angered voters. Raising taxes angered voters. Doing both risked political collapse. Yet doing nothing meant insolvency. Historically, states solved this problem through borrowing. Debt allowed governments to spend today while deferring the pain. As long as economies grew and interest rates remained manageable, debt looked harmless. In fact, it became normalized. Deficits stopped being emergency tools and became standard operating procedure. But debt still had limits. Creditors demanded confidence. Markets punished reckless borrowing. Eventually, even debt required justification. Governments still faced the same fundamental constraint. Money had to come from somewhere, and traditional taxation remained politically toxic. This is where the old tax model began to crack. The problem was not legality. Governments still had the legal power to tax. The problem was legitimacy. Voters had become sensitive to explicit taxation. Every new tax law triggered media cycles, opposition campaigns, and electoral consequences. In democratic systems especially, this created a strong incentive to avoid visible extraction. At the same time, economic management became more complex. Modern economies relied on financial systems, central banks, regulatory agencies, and administrative rules that barely existed a century earlier. Power migrated away from parliaments toward institutions that were technically independent but practically aligned with state objectives. This shift created an opportunity. If money could be taken without calling it a tax, the political cost dropped dramatically. If the extraction could be framed as stabilization, compliance, safety, or efficiency, resistance softened. Most importantly, if it did not require a vote in Parliament, it could happen quietly. The early signs were subtle. Adjustments to monetary policy were presented as technical necessities, not fiscal choices. Fees replaced taxes in certain areas, justified as user pay systems. Regulatory requirements increased, imposing costs without appearing in budgets. None of these look like taxation in the traditional sense, but their economic effect was similar. What changed was not the state's need for revenue, but the method of collection. The legal requirement for taxation remained on paper. But in practice, governments learned that they could achieve the same result through indirect mechanisms that bypass legislative scrutiny. This marked a turning point. The question was no longer how do we raise taxes, but how do we extract resources without triggering political resistance? Once that question was answered, the old model of taxation opened, debated, and constrained by law became optional rather than essential. The transition did not happen overnight, and it was rarely announced. There was no declaration that taxes would no longer require permission. Instead, governments discovered that modern economic tools allowed them to shift the burden quietly, incrementally, and often invisibly. And once that discovery was made, there was no incentive to go back. Inflation was never introduced to the public as a tax. It arrived dressed as a solution, a temporary adjustment, a necessary side effect of progress. Yet over time, governments learned that inflation could do what legislated taxes increasingly could not: transfer resources from society to the state without a vote, a bill, or a public confrontation. At its core, inflation is simple. When supply of money grows faster than the supply of goods and services, each unit of money buys less. Prices rise. Wages lag. Savings shrink. No law needs to be passed for this to happen. No tax rate needs to be announced. The effect appears slowly, unevenly, and often confusingly. That confusion is what makes inflation politically useful. Traditional taxes are immediate and visible. Inflation is delayed and abstract. People notice prices rising, but they rarely connect that rise directly to government financing. Instead, inflation is blamed on corporations, supply chains, foreign conflicts, or vague market forces. This diffusion of responsibility allows governments to extract value without being seen as a collector. The mechanism works through public debt and monetary policy. When governments spend more than they collect in taxes, they issue bonds. In theory, those bonds are purchased by investors who expect repayment. In practice, modern central banks play a critical role. By purchasing government debt directly or indirectly, they expand the money supply. The state receives spending power today, while the cost is spread across the population over time through reduced purchasing power. This process accelerated dramatically after major crises. Following the 2008 financial collapse, central banks in the United States, Europe, and Japan engaged in large-scale asset purchases. The policy was framed as emergency stabilization. Interest rates were pushed near zero. Trillions in new currency entered the financial system. Officially, this was not taxation, but its effects were unmistakable. Those who held cash or fixed income savings saw their real wealth decline. Retirees living on nominal pensions found that their money bought less each year. Workers whose wages adjusted slowly fell behind rising living costs. Meanwhile, asset owners benefited. Stocks, real estate, and other assets inflated in price, protecting those already positioned to hedge against currency debasement. This is why inflation functions like a regressive tax. It does not scale with income by law, but by financial access. Those closest to the creation of new money governments, banks, large institutions spend it before prices fully adjust. Those farthest from it pay the highest cost. This phenomenon, often described by economists as a Cantillon effect, ensures that inflation redistributes wealth upward while appearing neutral. Crucially, none of this requires parliamentary approval. Central banks are often legally independent, insulated from electoral politics. Their mandates price stability, employment, financial stability are broad enough to justify expansive intervention. When inflation rises, it is framed as an unfortunate consequence of necessary policy, not as deliberate extraction. The COVID-19 pandemic made this dynamic impossible to ignore. Governments faced unprecedented spending needs while shutting down large parts of their economies. Instead of raising taxes in the middle of a crisis, they borrowed and spent on a massive scale. Central banks absorbed the debt. Money supplies surged. In the years that followed, inflation rose sharply across developed economies, even where no new tax laws were passed. From a political perspective, this was a success. Governments funded relief programs, avoided immediate backlash, and postponed the cost. The public felt the pain later, dispersed across higher grocery bills, rent increases, and eroding savings. No single policy could be blamed. No vote could be overturned. Inflation also has a unique advantage. It reduces the real value of existing debt. For heavily indebted governments, this is not a side effect, it is a feature. When prices rise, past obligations become easier to repay in nominal terms. Creditors lose purchasing power. Debtors gain flexibility. The state, as the largest debtor in the economy, benefits disproportionately. This creates a quiet incentive structure. While officials publicly commit to fighting inflation, moderate and sustained price increases ease fiscal pressure without legislative risk. Unlike taxes, which are difficult to roll back politically, inflation can be described as temporary, transitory, or externally driven even when it persists. Over time, societies adapt. People expect prices to rise. Wage negotiations incorporate inflation assumptions. Long-term savings shift toward assets rather than cash. What was once considered monetary instability becomes normal. In this environment, inflation loses its stigma and becomes a background condition of economic life. Yet its function remains unchanged. Inflation transfers resources from the public to the state by weakening money itself. It operates continuously, silently, and without consent. It does not appear on tax forms, but it reduces real income just as effectively. By the time citizens recognize the cost, the extraction has already occurred. There is no single law to repeal, no tax to abolish. The mechanism is embedded in the system. And when inflation alone is not enough, governments turn to something even less controversial: fees that look voluntary and charges that sound administrative, but function just like taxes. Once governments realized that taxation did not need to be called a tax, the next step was refinement. Inflation worked well, but it was blunt. It affected everyone unevenly and carried the risk of public anger if prices rose too fast. Fees, on the other hand, offered something more precise: targeted extraction with minimal political exposure. The distinction between a tax and a fee is largely linguistic. A tax is mandatory and broad. A fee is framed as conditional payment in exchange for access, service, or compliance. This framing changes public perception. People resist taxes because they feel imposed. Fees feel transactional, even when there is no real choice involved. Governments increasingly leaned into this distinction. Instead of raising income or sales taxes, they expanded systems of charges attached to everyday activities: driving, owning property, operating a business, transferring money, filing documents. All became opportunities for revenue that did not require new tax legislation. One reason fees are so attractive is procedural. In many legal systems, taxes must be approved by legislatures, but fees can be set or adjusted by regulatory agencies or executive bodies. A ministry can raise a processing fee. A transport authority can increase tolls. A financial regulator can impose compliance charges. These decisions rarely make headlines, and they almost never trigger mass protests. The scope of fee-based extraction is enormous. Environmental fees are added to fuel, utilities, and manufacturing, justified as incentives for sustainability. Infrastructure fees appear on vehicle registrations, airline tickets, and shipping costs, explained as maintenance funding. Financial transaction fees are imposed in the name of stability and oversight. Each charge is small in isolation. Together, they rival traditional tax revenue. Penalties function similarly. Late fees, fines, and administrative sanctions generate income while being framed as enforcement rather than taxation. The logic is simple. If you follow the rules, you do not pay. In practice, modern regulatory systems are so complex that noncompliance is often unavoidable. The line between punishment and revenue collection blurs. This model has a critical advantage. It shifts responsibility. When people complain about rising costs, governments can respond that they are not taxes, but payment for services, protections, or externalities. The burden feels individualized rather than collective. You pay because you drive, because you file late, because you operate a business, not because the state needs money. Businesses experience this acutely. Licensing fees, renewal fees, inspection fees, certification fees, and reporting costs accumulate year after year. Each one is justified on technical grounds. None of them are debated like tax increases. For large corporations, these costs are absorbed or passed on. For small businesses, they often determine survival. Consumers ultimately pay as well. Fees imposed on banks appear as higher account charges. Fees imposed on logistics providers raise retail prices. Fees imposed on utilities show up on monthly bills under opaque labels. The public sees rising costs, but the source is fragmented across dozens of agencies and rules. Unlike taxes, fees are rarely rolled back. Once introduced, they become part of the administrative baseline. Inflation may fluctuate. Tax rates may change with governments. Fees persist quietly, adjusted upward over time under the justification of cost recovery or service improvement. This system also avoids moral debate. Taxes invite questions about fairness, redistribution, and social priorities. Fees avoid those questions by focusing on procedure. The conversation shifts from, is this extraction justified, to, is this process necessary? That shift dramatically lowers resistance. Over time, governments become dependent on these revenue streams. Budgets quietly incorporate fee income as stable funding. Agencies are incentivized to expand their scope because their operations are self-financing through charges. The more rules they enforce, the more revenue they generate. This creates a feedback loop. Regulation produces fees. Fees justify expanded administration. Expanded administration produces more regulation. None of this requires a tax vote. None of it requires public consent in the traditional sense. And yet, fees still have limits. They can be noticed. They can provoke backlash if they become too visible or too concentrated. To go further, governments needed a mechanism that imposed costs without collecting money, directly one that transformed compliance itself into a form of taxation. That mechanism was regulation. Regulation is the most advanced form of taxation modern governments have developed, not because it collects money directly, but because it forces society to spend money on behalf of the state. Unlike taxes, regulations do not appear as line items on pay slips or receipts. They operate through obligations, standards, and procedures that quietly convert private resources into public objectives. Every regulation creates a cost. Compliance requires time, labor, reporting systems, legal advice, audits, technology upgrades, and operational changes. None of these payments are labeled as taxes, yet their economic effect is identical. Money that could have been used for wages, investment, or consumption is redirected to meet government-mandated requirements. The brilliance of regulation as a fiscal tool lies in its invisibility. When a business spends millions to meet environmental standards, the state does not receive that money directly. Instead, it mandates behavior that forces spending elsewhere. The political burden disappears. There is no accusation of confiscation because no one appears to be collecting the money. This cost is passed on. Companies raise prices to recover compliance expenses. Workers face lower wage growth as firms absorb regulatory overhead. Consumers pay more for goods and services without ever seeing a tax increase announced. The burden spreads across the economy in ways that are difficult to measure and almost impossible to attribute to a single decision. Crucially, regulatory costs do not show up in government budgets. They are not debated in fiscal committees. They do not appear in deficit calculations. From a political perspective, this is ideal. Governments can expand their influence and achieve policy goals while keeping official spending figures under control. Environmental regulation provides a clear example. Emission standards, reporting requirements, and technology mandates compel firms to invest heavily in compliance infrastructure. These investments are framed as moral or scientific necessities. Whether one agrees with the goals or not, the economic reality is clear. Resources are extracted from the private sector without taxation law. Financial regulation works the same way. Capital requirements, stress tests, reporting obligations, and compliance departments impose enormous costs on banks and financial institutions. These costs are justified as stability measures, but they also raise barriers to entry, consolidate industry power, and ultimately increase costs for borrowers and consumers. Technology regulation increasingly follows this pattern. Data protection, cybersecurity standards, content moderation rules, and licensing regimes require constant spending. Firms must hire specialists, build systems, and monitor compliance. Smaller players struggle. Larger players absorb the cost and gain advantage. The state shapes markets without collecting a cent directly. What makes regulation especially powerful is that it bypasses democratic scrutiny. Regulatory agencies operate under delegated authority. Their rules are often written by experts, not elected officials. Public consultation is limited. Opposition is technical, not political. The average citizen has little capacity to challenge complex regulatory frameworks. Once implemented, regulations are rarely reversed. Removing a regulation is portrayed as weakening protections or endangering the public. Even when costs are high and benefits are marginal, repeal becomes politically toxic. The extraction becomes permanent. Over time, the cumulative effect is staggering. Studies attempting to quantify regulatory burden consistently find costs comparable to or exceeding major tax categories. Yet because these costs are distributed and indirect, they fail to trigger the same resistance as explicit taxation. This completes the transformation. Governments no longer rely primarily on visible taxes approved by legislatures. Instead, they operate a layered system. Inflation erodes purchasing power, fees drain income through administration, and regulation compels private spending at scale. Each layer reinforces the others. The result is a fiscal state that can extract vast resources without passing new tax laws. Consent becomes procedural rather than democratic. Citizens comply not because they agreed, but because the system leaves no alternative. Taxes did not disappear. They evolved. They moved out of parliament, out of budgets, and out of public debate into mechanisms that feel technical, neutral, and unavoidable. And by the time people recognize them for what they are, there is nothing left to vote against.